Welcome to Baptist Bridges, a podcast by the Canadian Baptists of Ontario and Quebec. We will explore a variety of topics that we trust will be meaningful to people and churches around the world. We're glad you're here.
Hello, and welcome to our 5th episode of our first season of Baptist Bridges. Today's topic, I truly believe, as all of them are, but in a very particular way, today's topic, I think, is relevant for everyone. And if it's not relevant in this exact moment, or maybe doesn't feel relevant in this moment, there is a day that it will be relevant or has been relevant. Today, we're talking about a topic that for those of you who know me will know is very dear to my heart. And we're talking about grief, specifically ministering while grieving. As leaders and people working in our various churches, whether we are pastors, deacons, elders, Sunday school teachers, youth group leaders, there will be times when we will have to figure out what it means to lead and serve others as we are going through our own seasons of loss and grief. I think that this is such a common experience that we don't always talk about. Sometimes we'll be grieving collectively as a congregation. We'll be grieving for people that have died from our own church family, and we're grieving together. Sometimes we'll be carrying our own personal losses. And somehow in the midst of those seasons, we're trying to learn about our own grief. We're trying to care for ourselves, let God care for us. And we still have to lead. We still have our sermons that we're preaching. We still have our meetings that we're leading. We still have the people that we're teaching, those we're visiting and caring for, all while we may be carrying that grief ourselves. That's why I say I think this topic is truly relevant to all of us. And even if you're thinking, I'm not grieving, I haven't grieved, maybe there's nothing on the horizon, of course, all of that's unpredictable. You will know people who are grieving, and you'll know leaders who are grieving. And we hope this can also help you learn how to encourage and support them. One of the things that I often say in the grief work that I do, and full disclaimer, as many of you may know, is that I consider myself a grief educator, and I do quite a lot of grief support through a grief community online called Grieving Room. And I've written a book about grief, and I have a certificate in death and bereavement. So a topic I care about a lot. And one of the things that I often say is that grief is universal. The experiences of grief have so many commonalities across them. So we can have different griefs and say, oh, me too. I'm not crazy. That's normal. That's part of grief. And grief is profoundly unique. So it's this incredible thing where we're going through a truly unique individual experience because our individual grief is completely different. Even if you're grieving for the same person, your grief will be different than the person grieving that same person. But yet we have all these universal things we carry. I'm so thankful for my two guests today who've joined us to talk about that experience of ministering while grieving. Their names are Tracy and Jeremy. And please tell us who you are. So Tracy, would you start by introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm Tracy Bagley, and I pastor at South Cayuga Baptist Church half-time. We're a little rural church. There's about 30 of us or so. And then I also have the privilege of working at Canadian Baptist Women of Ontario and Quebec. And my title is very fancy. It's like Director of Leadership and Discipleship, but that just means I get to really encourage women as they're on their journeys of faith and calling them closer to Jesus. So both of them are just great opportunities, and I'm so privileged to be able to do both of those.
It's just been wonderful, Tracy, to see what you're doing in Cayuga, and then to also see the beautiful work you're doing with our Soul Days and Soul Sisters with Baptist women. When I know lots listening here will so appreciate the work you do, as I have.
Oh, thank you.
And Jeremy, would you tell us a bit about who you
For sure. Thank you for having me. My name is Jeremy Ng. I am a lay leader and a deacon at East Toronto Community Baptist Church. We're a church in Toronto with very typical kind of Chinese church, 3 different congregations. But professionally, I'm a social worker, and so I do a lot of work with children, youth, and families.
I'm so pleased for you both to be here today because you represent two different grief experiences, one more of a collective grief, one more of a personal. You represent different roles of leadership. So a deacon and a pastor, different deaths, a very sudden death, an untimely death, one that was had more time to prepare. So we're going to really cover a lot of different sides of things with that today. And I think we need to start by understanding a bit of the grief experience you bring to this conversation. So, Jeremy, would you tell us a bit about the experience of loss that we're going to be discussing a bit today as you share from this experience?
Definitely. Our grief experience and journey starts last September when we unexpectedly get the news that our long-term pastor, Tim Tang, had died unexpectedly while on a family vacation with some friends. Now, some of you may recognize the name Tim Tang. He was the director at the Tim Center at Tyndale and has spoken at probably at many churches and consulted for many people. But for our community, he was our pastor. He had been our pastor for over 20 years. And in a relatively young congregation, he had walked with people throughout life, from high school to seeing them get married and being their officiant, to celebrating births of children and deaths of family members. Tim and his wife, Joanne, lived and ministered in a way that was authentic and vulnerable into their community, that they regularly had us over. And so when we heard this unexpected and shocking news, Tim was not even 50 yet. There was this immediate sadness and shock for Joanne and the children, for ourselves as a congregation. And it showed up throughout the year. From those initial meetings of informing people about Tim's death to Sundays where people were just in tears because Tim was so intertwined in the culture of East Toronto, from leading worship to participating in meetings. But even now, a year later, where we have some folks who are getting married and had hoped and expected that Tim would have been their officiant. And so that journey of grief is still ongoing, and it's a bit of a mess still.
So many of us listening will know Tim and join you in the grief we felt when we heard of this truly tragic loss. And you named so many things there, that you were in the experience of grieving as a community, grieving with and for each other, grieving for Tim's widow and children. But Jeremiah, I know also grieving yourself, because Tim was a personal friend, mentor, leader for you.
Yeah. I had known Tim for over almost my whole life. Tim and Joanne, I've known them for a long time. And so it was a personal, like, I was totally lost because Tim would be the person that I went to when I had a struggle. And so how do I find support for myself? How do I, being so close to Joanne and their kids, how do I take care of them? It still is really challenging, and trying to work through that. And yeah.
And you were caring for others. And I well remember the day that Tim, that you shared with your church that he had passed away. I think it was just the day right after he had actually died. And you reached out to CBOQ, and I was brand new in this role. And you said, because you were trying to care for your church, you said, we're putting together an event tonight so everyone can come grieve. And I was so struck by this group of, you have a very active group of lay leaders. You have a unique leadership model at this church where you all preach and you lead together. And you all came in there to care for everyone else as tears were streaming down your own faces. And one of my memories is everyone who came in had like these giant amounts of food. So someone came in with like 4 bottles, cases of water, and there was all these cookies and all this food. And everyone was just trying to care for each other, before everyone showed up. There was such a sense of, well, we're grieving, but now we got to lead our church through this, which is exactly what we're talking about today. We're leading and we're grieving. It was beautiful, but I was so struck by what a weight it was you carried. Thank you for what you were doing then.
I think it was part of the culture of the church that we have to show up in hard times, to be vulnerable and authentic with who we are and where we're at. That first night, we didn't have any answers, right? We had to sit in the pain of it all and the shock, to not spiritualize it, but just to say, this is how we're going to walk through this together.
Thank you, Jeremy. So just to for filling in that story there. And I know many of us are already feeling that weight of that loss. Tracy, your loss was a personal one, although shared by a community. Tell us about this very recent loss for you as well.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for asking me to share it, but yeah, I'll do my best. I'm just such a teary thing.
Well, we've already named, if you're watching the video, there's tissues on the table. This is one of these conversations where tears and pauses and emotions, there's room for them here. So thank you for being willing to share. And we are okay with whatever comes with that.
Thank you. So actually, my loss, the year anniversary, it was my father. And it'll be on Sunday.
Wow.
So it's just, and I've never walked to this before, so I don't totally know how I'm feeling going into this, right? But so my dad was one of my very favorite people, and I just have one brother, and so every time I greeted my dad, I would say, "Oh, look, it's my favorite father," and he would say, "Oh, hello, darling." It's my favorite daughter. And so just even that, right? To walk into their home now and no one says, "Hello, darling," those kinds of things, right? But it was in 2014, my dad was diagnosed with lung cancer.
Wow.
And the fact that he lived for 10 years or 9 years is almost unheard of, right? So this extra part of his life was a gift. But the journey sort of always kind of started back then, right? And then there were huge up and downs, right? Chemo treatments, and we thought, that almost took him. And then he got pneumonia, and that almost took him. And then he just kept coming back. And so there was always hope that he was going to keep coming back, right? And at the time when my dad was the sickest, we were pastoring in Kingsville. And so it was actually during the pandemic that as he was getting older and sicker, that we thought, you know what, we've got to move home. We were born and raised in Bimbrook. Our kids and our grandkids were in Hamilton. So we came back, and unknowing what we were going to be doing, but knowing to this day that it was God who brought us back for this time to be close, to be present, right? And when we first came back as well, I had my grandmother. And so she, so we've had loss that way, right? So, and then in the summer of 2022, and as a family, we all spend the summers together at a trailer in Lindsay, and we fish together and we play cards and we hang out. And so he hadn't been doing that great, but we had a good summer. And so as we closed everything up, we thought maybe this is the last summer, right? And that fall, we were talking, and he said, Trace, I've just asked the Lord if I could just have one more summer. But then he said, how selfish is that? Look at all the summers I've had, right? Well, the Lord was very gracious and gave us one more summer. And that was the summer of 2023. And so some of the gifts in this long journey is taking every moment, right? To go fishing. To play that card game, to make sure you said those things, right? To ask him to tell some of the ridiculous stories of his childhood and secretly record it so that you're going to have it for later, right? But it was mostly in August, he really started to fail. And then we knew at the end of September that this was the last summer. And so through September and October, every day I went there. I either worked from there. I went, our houses are we live 20 minutes apart, and family came. And so, it was good to be together during that time, but hard at the same time. And in the beginning, my dad said, I want to go to hospice because I don't want to die at home, and, all of those things. Right. And turned out that my dad died at home, which was such a gift to all of us because we could be there, right? So such a difference in Jeremy's journey. Ours was long and expected, not predictable, and how I felt was not this. I couldn't describe it. I wouldn't have expected how the feelings. But to complicate that, my mom and dad go to my church. And so the folks at my church were grieving my dad. So that was tough, right? And so still, and trying to pastor, and, there's my mom, and trying to be so sensitive to my grief as a daughter, which is completely different to my brother's grief, to my mom's grief as burying her husband. So that complicated how to be, and then trying to pastor and not make it about me. That was really, I still don't know how I've done, and sometimes I don't know if I have really let myself completely grieve.
That's a really big statement there. And I think as we're listening to you, you said it's just coming up on the year. My guess is many people listening to that heard you say that and went, oh, because if we've had a loss, we know that those anniversaries can just be such a weight, and sometimes leading into them is even harder than the day of. But we can hear the emotion in your voice, that the grief is there, and that 10 years to prepare did not decrease the heaviness of grief. Like you said, two such different stories. And I'll very briefly add my experience, which I may be referring to, which is that in 2013, my older sister, Roxanne, died of cancer after living with cancer for 8 years. And I was pastoring at the time. I was the lead pastor of Mount Hamilton Baptist Church. I was 35 years old, and I had this dead sister. And it was a very disorienting experience. And I had a lot to learn about grief, and I'll maybe share some of those things as I go on as well. But we are eager here to talk about how we make space for this. And again, I think some listening will be going, oh, yes, this has been what I've been carrying too. I'm going to just kind of talk to each of you a little bit separately for a second before we come back together, although please jump in anytime. Because of these differences in the experience, the differences of your ministry. So Tracy, again, you experienced this personal loss, and you were a pastor. You said you were already a pastor for many years. You're pastor in Kingsville, pastor here. And you probably supported other people through grief. You probably have been at the funeral home, probably done funerals, all those things. You said, this was the first time I've been through a grief like this. What surprised you when suddenly you were experiencing grief, something you were probably pretty comfortable sitting with people in, but now you're experiencing it yourself? What was that like?
Yeah, that was really tough, actually, because so my personality is such that you just pull up your bootstraps and you keep going. You do that next thing, right? And so that's what I thought I was supposed to do, right? Just do the next thing. And that was probably not a great way to cope in the very beginning. And then when someone dies in your family, there's so much to do, which is very weird.
That's something that shocks everyone.
It's like,
the sheer to-do list of grief is overwhelming.
Yeah.
Paperwork, cleaning out homes, planning services. It's a lot.
And so we just did the next thing, right? You plan the funeral. What mostly surprised me was standing in the receiving line as people came to share stories of my dad. And I can remember he worked at the Ontario power generating station in Nanticoke, and all the men that he had worked with, and he'd been retired for ages, right? I don't think I said my dad was 83. So the other thing is he did get to live a good long life, but it doesn't mean that I didn't want him to live longer.
Of course.
Right?
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. So important to say. Yeah.
And so as these people came through the line, the overwhelming feeling of just like, you came, right? And I remember one particular person came. I hadn't probably seen her for 25 years. I realized who she was, and I just burst into tears. And then later it was like, I wonder why she made me cry like that, right? And so those are things that surprised me. And I was able to share a eulogy. Actually, each of our family members did. So the funeral was a gift. You kind of almost didn't want it to be over, because what do you do? Okay,
Yeah.
everybody leaves and everybody.
Then you grieve.
Yeah. And then you grieve, right? So then I think what the thing I didn't do and I should have done is I needed more time off. So the funeral was Monday.
Yeah. Okay.
I led my book study on Tuesday. I preached the following Sunday, and trying to say, I'm okay.
Yes.
I'm okay. And so outside, I'm trying to be okay. Tears come a little bit, but it's like someone's standing on my chest.
I want to pause there, if I may, Tracy, because when I talk to pastors, leaders, Jeremy, I'm guessing probably you talk to therapists and social workers in the same vein. Everyone says that. I'm not just saying some people say it. Everyone says, and I said the same thing. I had 3 weeks compassionate leave, and you kind of don't know what else to do with yourself, right? Because you wake up and you're like, I guess I just go back to like my life. And I don't know if you really can do anything different in the moment. But I guess what I would say is that's so common to say, I actually needed more time than I thought. And I would love to say to anyone who maybe is anticipating a loss, or they're thinking about how much time I should take off, you might need more time than you think.
Yeah.
But because you probably won't listen to me because you're grieving and it's so hard to get your brain around that, what I'll say instead is that if you didn't take the time off you needed, take it later. And it is okay to go back and say, oh, wow, I came back to work after a week and now it's been a month. And to go back to your deacon's board and say, yeah, oops, I need more time. I need more bandwidth, or whatever that looks like. Or can I take maybe do 30 hours instead of 40? Or can I do a little bit of this kind of ministry, a little bit less of this than that? Or I just need a bit more bandwidth right now. And the interesting thing is almost certainly you're going to have someone on that group that has grieved and is going to go, some of you are listening to this and going, that is exactly what happened. And they're going to go, yeah, we all knew you came back too soon. And that's okay. And again, I hope, so that's okay too. Jeremy, I see you nodding. I mean, you also are in a caregiving profession.
Sure.
There are things I'm sure you had that same experience of surprises and rushing, really later realizing unintentionally, I shouldn't say rushing, but eager to not knowing what to do, I think is what causes it really.
Yeah, I think I would say it's a recognition that grief isn't linear.
Right.
And it doesn't end. Right? Sometimes we have this idea that, okay, after the month, you might still be struggling, but you might be okay.
Yes.
Definitely after the year, you'll be fine. Right? But it's that recognition that sometimes it comes in waves.
Yes.
And how do we recognize that?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of pressure to kind of show that we're okay, because if we show that we're okay, then it allows everyone else to feel like they're going to be okay. We see this a lot with parents, right? I have to be strong for my kids. But what often happens is that the kids feel like they have to be strong too, and no one ends up having to be vulnerable and authentic about what's actually going on.
Right.
So then it actually puts up a lot of walls.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. And you know what else struck me, what you said, Tracy, is, I was surprised at all the people that showed up. And I think when I heard that, I thought, what an affirmation of what pastors, leaders do. We do wonder, I went to that funeral. I went to that visitation. I had a busy week. I had my sermon to preach, and I went to that visitation. I stood in the line. I only shook their hands for 2 minutes. Actually, leaders, it really matters when you do those things.
It really
and that
matters.
did strike me, that when I had that loss and all of a sudden people were making me the food and sending me the cards and talking to me, that even though maybe people hadn't had the words to say how much it had mattered to them, that, there is a reason that we're so present with people in their ministry. So we learn a lot when we're in ministry and we're grieving. It shapes how we do ministry for the rest of our lives, because we suddenly see all those things and how much they matter.
Actually, Tracy,
please.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
You mentioned at the end of your sharing that you felt like you didn't grieve completely. I'm curious, how do you think things would have been different if you had allowed yourself to do so?
I'm going to add to that. I'm curious what you think grieve completely looks like, or what it look like.
I don't mean
so both and. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't mean completed grief.
Yeah.
But I think I kept trying to, I even said things like, okay, I need to be strong for my mom. I need to be strong for these people. Okay, I'll schedule my breakdown for a month from now, right?
Sure.
Or there would be times where I would be sitting there and it would start to come and I'd be like, I don't have time for this.
Mhm.
Not today, right? So I didn't give myself permission necessarily to just let it go. And the gift was, though, I have some 3 a.m. friends,
Sure.
those ones that you can call at 3 a.m. and they'll come over. And so they would let me just be me and they would let me say and do those things. But even now, there's things that, I still expect my dad to walk back in the room, right? Or like this summer, I had to move his wheelbarrow and I literally just was in a complete ugly cry,
Sure.
right? Because my father spent a lot of his years moving that wheelbarrow in his, in his overalls, half zipped down with, this big gold chain sitting. Like so you see them that way, right? But to grieve completely, I needed more time.
Yeah.
And I was trying to schedule it.
It's
Does that make
interesting.
sense?
It's interesting because I sometimes say to people, actually schedule grief time. Like actually say, I need to leave bandwidth. What I mean by that is leave bandwidth to say, this is a night that I can fall apart if I need to. Because the
Right.
reality is we can't always
Yep.
just let it all out, right? We got to get the kids from school or we got it, whatever. So, but there's a mix between saying, I can just put it off till it's convenient.
Which is never.
Yeah. Amen.
Exactly.
Versus, I put some time in my schedule that if I have that Wednesday night and I want to just look at photo albums for 6 hours and cry my eyes out, I can.
Yeah.
And I think you've named something there. Tracy, this is what's interesting. In the midst of this, I'm hearing the heaviness of your grief. It's so beautiful what you're sharing. Thank you.
Oh.
You were ministering in this. You were still pastoring. So it wasn't like your job was to go and do something, just mindless. Not that, those jobs aren't important, but something that, didn't take a lot of mental exertion. You were actually trying to care for others. So what were some of that tension of being a caregiver, but you also needed care?
Yeah. Yeah. And trying to lead the church every Sunday and not make it about me.
Yeah.
But by the same token, be authentic. And they're a beautiful group of people that I get to minister to. I was telling Jeremy and Leanne earlier, like there's 30 of us. I'm the very youngest. And then the next one to me is like 72 to in their 90s, right? So they know how to care for you, but they're also all in their own seasons of grieving in different ways, right? So they still needed care and things were still happening. And so it was... Well, I will be just really honest. There were times where I felt like a poser as I was leading. And the reason would be that particular week, sure, I prepared something to say, but I couldn't really read scripture that week. I couldn't really pray. I didn't really know what was going on. What I was grateful for was written prayers, liturgy books that I'd come across. So I use those to kind of fill me up, if that makes.
I think that's brilliant, Tracy, because what I hear you saying with that is in a season where we're grieving and we're leading, we might need to make some modifications in how we lead. And so I'm hearing you say, the way I maybe would normally lead a prayer or scripture didn't feel something I could do. So I had to find another way. I love that idea. Maybe we can't kind of just open to prayer and see what comes out. We can use the written prayers. I know for me, I had to set some limits around what I felt capable of doing. And when my sister was dying, there was a woman at the church whose brother was also dying. And I had to say to my co-pastor, who happened to be my husband, and I remember saying, and I usually did all the funerals and that kind of stuff in our role. And I said, I can do the funeral, but I need you to look after her. I can't do it. And that wasn't an angry thing. That was but it's a very surreal thing when you have someone dying. I have a vivid memory of standing at a casket when this 90-year-old gentleman from our church died and staring at it on this very cold February day and going, the next time I stand in front of a casket, it's going to be my sister's.
Mm.
And then realizing I've now got to say all these words. I've got to do this, right? I haven't done the funeral yet because the casket's in front of me. And then I'm going to say ashes to ashes and dust to dust. Yeah. And it's a surreal thing. So I had to start thinking about what can I do and not do?
Mm-hmm.
And I love what you said, right? Okay, so I couldn't do these other prayers. So I use liturgy. That's brilliant. I think I think we need to give ourselves permission that ministry might look a little different in this season. Mm-hmm. As you look back, what were some of the things you tried to do that were unrealistic? You've named this. What were some of the things that you're like, I'm doing this as a pastor, I can do it, but now I'm like, maybe I didn't need to do that. What would have helped you be easier on yourself?
You know what? I don't know.
Yeah.
I've thought about that a lot and I really don't know. Right? Yeah, I actually think about that a lot.
Well, sometimes grief is just so hard.
I
think we do try to think that there's something that we could do that would make it easier or better. And it doesn't totally exist. But you did actually name it. You said, right, I should have taken more time off. Is one thing you said.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
It's hard.
But when you ask me like what would grieving completely look like, it's like, I want to hurry it up.
Don't we? Yeah.
Right? I want to, okay, but I think there was some numbness. I'm very grateful though that we can talk about my dad.
Yes.
And so the one thing that brings me great.
So great.
He was great. He was great. He was the youngest of 13.
Oh my.
Had a horrible, not a great upbringing. And he just was such a great dad. And so my maiden name was Smith. And so I always just said, I won the Smith lottery because I wouldn't have wanted maybe some other Smiths to be my parent.
And, when I think of your loss, Tracy, if I may, I'm so struck by, when we lose parents. And I think that's probably the most common loss we'll probably have as pastors, right? Because that is one that most of us will experience unless we ourselves die an untimely death. And when you said that moment about I would walk in the house and he would say, there's my favorite daughter. There is a loss in that, in how you are seen and known and loved, that is so profound when you carry in a grief.
Yeah.
And how that shapes your identity as you go forward, when that grounding can feel, we can lose that. And it can make it hard to pastor, because pastoring, the identity is you're pastoring. It can be so easy to get caught up in what other people think of you. And like when you have those people that go, no, I just see you. You're mine. You're my girl. That's a loss as you're pastoring.
And not seeing him sit where he always sat, right beside my mom.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Right. So and it's a little church, right? So it's like all of a sudden, Harold's not sitting there anymore. And he was always listening, even though he was very deaf. And he would be the one on the way home and he'd say, well, I didn't like it when you said this. And what do you think about that? And so I miss that.
Yeah.
Right. I miss those things because he was so honest. Right.
And what a gift. And again, I'm just picturing looking out and actually seeing the gap and having that face show on a Sunday morning. That is a hard thing. Jeremy, again, differences in your experience, and you were part of this church your all church was grieving for your dad, as you said, but this church had lost a pastor. I think that's such a rare experience. I think I can't think of many examples where that's happened. And so tragically, and suddenly you said he was 49. So can you tell us a bit about what your church did as a community to grieve? How did you do that as a church? What did you learn?
We learned it's really hard.
Excellent answer. And
yes. it's a mess. Right. And I think if you were to ask people even now, they'd be like, it still feels like a bit of a mess.
Right.
As I've been reflecting back, there were some things that were important to us and have been important to us as part of our culture. Part of it is showing up and being authentic with each other. And so that first day, even as the leaders, we were finding out about the news and we were still in shock. We were trying to figure out, okay, so what do we do now? How do we hold all these tensions in place? How do we care for Joe and the children? How do we care for our church? How do we create the space? And one of the first things we did was to say, okay, let's meet tonight because that's all we know, right? We got to get together.
Yeah.
One, we got to inform people about what's happened,
Mhm.
and talk about what it's going to look like. Leanne, you mentioned we had spoken with CBOQ and yourself around, we can't do this all on our own either.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah,
it
you
was,
reached out for help.
and we reached out, right, to model that
So
we're going to
good.
talk about what we need to talk about, and share that this is going to be difficult for us,
Mhm.
and also to be ministered to that we can't do it all on our own.
Mhm.
And I think throughout the year, there have been different moments where we have intentionally acknowledged grief, not just for Tim, but for all the different people that have died.
Mhm.
Because there was like Good Friday where there was chances to share about loss and have
Mhm.
people reveal what
Mhm.
they've been going through.
Mhm.
At the 1 year mark, Joanne was willing to share about her experience of loss
Mhm.
and
Tim's wife.
Tim's wife and what that looked like for her. And so throughout the year, there have been different moments where we have hopefully created enough of a culture to say that this is okay,
Mhm.
that we can talk about it, that it's okay to not have it all figured out even a year later. But it takes a lot of intention to do that,
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
because there's all these tensions that you're working through, right? As someone who's leading a church, as much as the story involves Tim, it's also not just about Tim,
Yes.
right? Um, One of the things that I'm grateful for at our community is that there really is a shared leadership team, because sometimes it's easy to think, okay, this is my experience of grief, and this is what I want to talk about, what I want to go through. And to have a group of people that you are serving with that you can lean on to be like, well, is this actually what I should be saying or preaching about, is so valuable.
Mhm.
To have people being willing to cover for you.
Mhm.
If you're like, you know what, this is just going to be a hard week and I need someone else to preach for me, and to have that shared leadership, uh, I don't think we could have done it with any other group.
Mm.
Um,
I think Tim would have been pretty impressed because, of course, he was such a big part of setting up that
mhm.
structure. I'm so interested in it's so beautiful to hear what your church did. I'm curious, if I may, you named this, well, it wasn't the only loss in the room, right? So you've all grieved
Right.
this pastor. Joanne's lost her husband, but other people have lost husbands or parents in the room. How did you name that tension about it not becoming all about Tim? Like this is the biggest thing that's ever happened to us. Probably collectively it is. How
Yeah.
do you, and you named that too, Tracy, like, how do I get up and be authentic, but not make it all about me? I'd love to hear both your thoughts on that. How do we balance that? We are authentically grieving, and we also acknowledge that there's other things in the room, that it's not just about either this one loss or my loss.
I think part of it is recognizing, just naming that, right?
Hmm.
That yes, we all recognize that Tim had deep relationships with many people at East Toronto, but especially for folks who were newer, or even folks that have come after Tim died in the past year,
Of
who didn't know
course.
Tim,
Right.
and were witness to it. It's how, but we've all experienced loss in some way, or we will experience loss
Mhm.
eventually. And how do we acknowledge that and
Mm.
just allow ourselves to walk in that loss and struggle and pain?
I
Yeah.
think there's such a beauty in acknowledging. So often I think the language both of you use is be strong, be strong. Like we're showing everyone, like, look how, I wonder what, I think the word strong is interesting too, because I think actually it takes a lot of strength to break down in front of someone and be vulnerable is actually a pretty strong thing to do. But we have this mentality that we're trying to model, like keeping it all together. I actually wonder if as leaders, when we model authentic grief, that we give permission for people to grieve who've
Mhm.
needed that permission. And that becomes a beautiful thing. So
Mhm.
how did you negotiate that? I'm trying to be authentic. And I'm also
Yeah.
trying not to make it the Tracy grief fest. That was a weird way to word it, but I think that's how I felt in my head, right? When I was
Right.
grieving.
Right. Just a couple of things is when the tears did come, I let them come,
Yeah.
and they were great about that. And there would be a couple of women at the end going, "I think you need a hug today," and I'd be like, "Yes, I do." So let that come. Um, I learned a few weeks in that I did have to every once in a while not name that, just say, I just want you guys to know it's been a really tough week. And so
Mhm.
I'm just here as me. And,
Yeah.
you know, I'm just trying to be your pastor, but sometimes I'm just feeling not that pastorish.
Oh, what a beautiful thing to
Yeah.
name. And Jeremy, you mentioned Joanne
hmm
and that she taught you a lot. Because this must have been an interesting experience for her to be
Oh,
grieving
yeah.
her husband, and then this whole church is grieving. I have to confess that I might have felt like, okay, guys, he was my husband,
Yeah.
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
should be, focused on my loss, my family's loss. But it sounds like that's not what she did. And you told me you learned a lot from Joanne.
Yeah. We are so, so grateful for Joanne. She has been a real model of what it means to courageously grieve in public.
Wow.
Um, Absolutely. Are there times when it's just her own grief? Absolutely, of course. But she has been so intentional to invite us in to see what it looks like
Mm.
from the little moments, and I use that very loosely, of coming to children's performances and just being a part of that, to the more obvious ones like their wedding anniversary, to sharing publicly what that past year has been. And in many ways, though, for her, like I was sharing earlier about that first night that we had, and we had the gathering together. Now, this was the day after Tim had died. We weren't sure if Joanne and their children were going to show up. And we would have totally understood if they didn't, because it was the day after. They may have just wanted to be on their own. They may have just had a million things to do. So many reasons.
Right.
But they showed up.
They did.
And they showed up, and I think it meant the world to us, because that's what they knew, to be in community when all of life is going sideways.
Mm.
But these were disciplines and a way that they lived life beforehand,
Mhm.
right? This
Right.
was a practice that they had done beforehand, so that when things do go hard, this is what I fall back on. This is what I know to do. I don't know how to
Yeah.
do anything else but to show up.
Mhm.
And throughout the years, she and her kids have shown up time and time again for us.
Mm.
She has shown up in a way that sometimes allows us to care for her.
Mhm.
Absolutely. But also allows her to be a healing presence for us as well.
Oh, that's so powerful.
On their wedding anniversary, she invited many of us, most of the whole congregation, to their home.
Wow.
And obviously, sometimes there are times when you want to be by yourself, but making intentional choices to be present.
Mhm.
And for many of our congregation who showed up, it was a very healing experience for them to be in a space that some of them hadn't been in since Tim had died, where they would regularly be at.
Right.
To the 1 year mark where she shared that to our congregation that Tim's toothbrush was still on the sink a year later, and that story of grief isn't over yet.
Mm.
And so I think there's been this realness about what it means to grieve publicly. And I think we've been so appreciative of that, because I don't think we would have gotten as far as we've come on
Mm.
this journey without her, for sure.
Well, I mean, she sounds like such an example of helping show how to share our loss in a way that actually becomes almost a gift to others, which I think in leadership can be real for us too. We have to know our own needs and limits and vulnerabilities. But the same question I asked Tracy, maybe I'm not sure my exact wording when I said it, but what have you learned? So, Jeremy, you are also grieving. And so, what did you learn? What would you say you've discovered about what it was like to be trying to care for others, because you do carry this weight of leading your church through this? I know we talked about it a few times, but also making space for your grief. How did you make space for your grief in the midst of that?
Mm-hmm. I think in the formal ways, what was really helpful. So as a social worker, I'm a huge advocate for counseling.
Mm.
And so it was important for me to see a counselor
Mm.
as well, knowing how meaningful Tim's relationship was to me. And it's funny because I do a lot of counseling as well, and I do a lot of grief work. Sometimes I'm sitting in the session and I'm just like, I know exactly what you're going to ask me. Why am I here and paying for this? But
yet you
Yeah.
still want to talk about
and
it.
it's
You're
still like,
I
all
know
right.
the script, but now it's my turn and I need it.
And
Thank
it's
you.
and so it's helpful to have that focus on you. Because so often in our profession, in the work we do, it's not about us.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? Or it's shared, but sometimes it's important to just have your own space.
Yes.
So to have that, I think some of the practice, so that's been really helpful for me. And again, counseling, I would encourage everyone to do even before stuff happens, because then you have that relationship with the person to talk through life with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It can be hard for leaders. I know. So one of the journeys with me was, and forgive what's going to sound arrogant, so I was kind of fussy about a counselor, and I went to one and I had a really bad experience, and I kind of was like, okay, I could do better than that. I'll be on, right? It just, and again, it was extreme. She referred to my sister's funeral as how nice it must have been to have a family reunion. I almost left. But fortunately, I had a husband who encouraged me not to give up and try again. And I do think it's so interesting when you say that we have to realize as caregivers, we need care. And the woman I went to was a Christian, understood my role as a pastor. And I remember the first time I went, I talked for like 2.5 hours. I didn't even realize I had done that. And I talk a lot, but I struggled deeply to talk about my grief. And I would be at church with people saying, how are you? And I'd say, I'm hanging in. And I often tell people to try and think of when you're in that grief space and you're going to be asked a million questions and you're not ready to open up, like what's the line you're going to say that feels fair? Mine was, I'm hanging in. Thanks for asking. But sometimes I'd walk away and think, why did I just lie? Because I'm not.
Right.
So I still remember this dear therapist, and I talk, and she says, I'm just going to schedule you in for an hour and a half next time. Which therapists don't do. And it was this free counseling service. And I was like, okay. And she looked at me and she said, you spend all your days caring for other people.
Yeah.
And this is where someone's going to care for you.
Yeah.
It was so profound. And no one had really ever looked at me and said that before. And it meant a lot. And so I hope pastors hearing that don't give up until you find that person that can help care for you, even if maybe you've had some rough experiences. If you're real stuck, call CBOQ and let us help find someone for you.
Well, and mine wasn't a counselor, but I've had a spiritual director
Sure.
for years, right?
Yes.
And without that, it's exactly that. It was that person who just listened to me for an hour.
Mm-hmm.
And when I would say things like, but I'm missing Jesus. Right. And that's like,
Sure.
I can't find him. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then, he would help me say, what about here? Oh, that's where he was. And so it was a beautiful gift to have that. So the same idea, right?
Sure.
To have someone else listen to me. But over and over, Jeremy, you've said it. It's the ministry of presence when people are hurting.
Yes.
Right? Showing up, being there. And I think that's probably what meant the most to me. And then it's just a great reminder as people are hurting, I don't have to know what to say or what to do. Just show up.
And really, there's nothing you can say or do.
No.
Right? We can't save people out of the situation.
Yep.
No.
So all we can do is be present.
That's right. My line is I love to say to people when they say, what should I say to grievers? People ask me this all the time. And I say, if you remember that your goal is not to fix a griever, because you can't fix it,
right?
But it's to support and love a griever, it'll change what you say and how you respond. So letting go of trying to fix them, you're not, but support and love them and say, I'm here for you. But as pastors, it can be hard to find leaders, it can be hard to find those people who are going to do that for us. So I think some of the journey is also learning to ask for it.
For sure.
And learning to name that you need it. And it can be hard for us to have to let that facade down a little bit when we've been used to being the people that people are looking to as the leaders, the strong ones, the carers, and now say, that's not where I am right now. But where I'd like, as we start to wind this down, what I'd like to say is, but what's the gift in that? Jeremy talked to me before about using honest language, about being real, being vulnerable, being real but honest. What is the gift to the people that we lead when we make space for that honesty and vulnerability?
Yeah. It's giving them the space to be honest and vulnerable. I think one of the places, and I would have not known this before, and so this is maybe for people if they've always wondered, there's blue Christmas services. I always thought, well, that's kind of weird. And then last year, and because my dad died in November, right, the 17th of November, it was not that long after, and I went to this blue Christmas service that my husband led at Mount Hamilton Baptist Church because he was the interim pastor at the time. And I sat there, and it was probably the most meaningful.
I love the blue Christmas service.
It was incredible. And that was a place actually where I didn't know I was overcome. I sat there and I had my breakdown. And I remember there were some people there and some knew me and they just, can we do anything? And then they would ask, should we just leave her alone? He goes, because it was a gift to be able to do that. So I think even that, like modeling that it is okay to go to a service and break down.
Yeah. And if for anyone who
That's
doesn't
a
know, a
gift.
blue Christmas service is the idea that you're blue at Christmas.
Yeah.
And it's a service usually for people grieving or struggling. Last year, actually, CBOQ put together a series of resources if that's something that you ever wanted to lead in your own church. Having led those for many years, there was only ever 10, 20 people at those services, but they were sacred. I love what you said, that you can see God in them. Jeremy, what would you add about when we make that space for vulnerability and honesty? What do we teach? And then I'm going to close with one more question.
I think on a very practical level, if I can do a little bit of grief or death education here.
Please.
We have a lot of troubles talking about death and dying in those very exact terms.
Yeah.
Right? Because it makes us feel uncomfortable.
That's right.
So often we use euphemisms like, oh, they passed away, or,
they're not here
anymore.
Yep.
And if I can just digress very briefly, especially for children, it's so important to include them in our grief, to talk about it with them. So a very quick way I like to explain death to children is just to say that when the body stops working and can't start again, so that they understand the concreteness of it.
Well said. Yeah.
Because when they can trust what you are saying and you are honest with your language, then it takes away the uncomfortability or the power of talking about death. Now, it was interesting because in our as part of the preaching team, in the fall, we would say general things like, oh, I know we're all grieving. I know we're having a difficult time. But without even realizing it, we stopped kind of mentioning Tim's name. We would just make it a very general statement. And I think everyone knew what we were talking about. But we until someone pointed it out to us, we were like, oh, right, we haven't mentioned Tim's name directly as part of our service. And we do that so easily without even recognizing. And going back to Joanne for a second, when she shared, there was something very contrasted. When she shared at the year mark, she made a really specific note, not just to mention Tim's name, but all the names of people who have been connected to our community who have died. From those who had died just a year ago to those who had died 15 years ago or longer. And there was such power in being seen for the people who have been grieving that sometimes you don't even remember. There's such power in that. J.S. Park, who talks about grief, says this line that remembrance is resurrection. And so that was such a good example of life coming when people are remembered and seen and named.
Oh, that's so beautifully
the
said.
Name out loud, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's
That's so true. And what a gift we can give if we model to others that you can say their names. And if we do that for other people too.
Absolutely.
And it takes that fear and cloud away. It doesn't take the sadness away.
That's right.
So I think we could talk for 3 hours. But as we just try to wrap this up in some way, I want to know what you would each want to say if to those listening who are in that season where they're trying to minister through their grief. I also want to say that grief can include grief for a lot of different things.
Yes.
Grief is the experience of loss, and you can grieve a death, but you can grieve a divorce, and you can grieve a broken relationship, and you can grieve someone that the relationship has disintegrated, and you might not even realize it's grief. But for anyone who is grieving in this season, and they're seeking to pastor, they're seeking to be a good deacon, elder, leader, what would be the thing you would want to say to them? Let's start with you, Tracy.
I would say be as honest as you can when you can, but also be so compassionate to yourself in the same way that I would show compassion to you as you're grieving. Try to do that for yourself if you can't, right? Show up, or if you can't say those things. And then the other thing I would really say, and I think this is what helped me, is make sure that you have some people, right? Maybe it's your spouse or whoever, or some 3 a.m. friends who you can just go and you can be grouchy, you can be sad, so that you can let that all out somewhere.
And it's okay if that's someone that you pay, like a counselor or a therapist, right?
Yeah. Or your spiritual director, like
Yeah,
all
absolutely.
of those
Yeah.
places, like
Yeah.
just so that you have a place to be heard. That's huge, right?
And sometimes who those people are, I would add, might be people that surprise you. Because often people will say, well, my best friend is terrible at this. And I'll say, actually, yeah, that can be a really hard part of grief, that the person who is you thought would be there for you isn't, and the people that you thought wouldn't be there for you are. And I say, sometimes you discover that your really good friend actually isn't good at grief, but they're still a great go to the mall and go for a walk and take your mind off it friend.
Absolutely.
And you suddenly discover that this person that maybe you didn't spend that much time with is actually the person you can really open up to. So giving yourself space to be surprised by who the supports may be in the different people, and letting that be okay, I think can help too. What about
Jeremy? Sorry, Jeremy, you said it perfectly. If you're ministering, say the name of the person, right? Like nothing, that's beautiful, because I love that. Remembrance is resurrection.
Amen.
That's incredible,
Keeping
right?
that.
And grief is the cost of loving someone so well, right? So yeah, being able to speak that out loud is such, so maybe I'm going to take away that I can do that better, right? I'm a little nervous, to be honest, going into this Sunday, right?
Yes, and it's a Sunday.
It's Sunday, and but so I don't think I'll acknowledge it unless I'm overcome with some kind of emotion, because I don't acknowledge the 1-year anniversary of everybody else who's lost people. So I'm trying to figure out, how can we grieve collectively with all the things that we're grieving, while this is going to be a particularly hard Sunday.
Yes. And it's so good for you to name that those are the things we're carrying. Yeah. That's a big one. Thank you, Tracy.
Yeah.
What about you? What would be the message you'd want to give, Jeremy?
Yeah. I think it allows, just the naming of people allows people to be seen when all we want to do is hide sometimes.
Yes.
Right? I think 2 things. I think one, I would just echo what Tracy was saying earlier about having grace and compassion for yourself. Regardless of whether it's a planned or anticipated death that's coming or a sudden one, the immediacy of it afterwards, you can't replicate that emotion or that experience. It's a bit of a mess at that point in time. And so I remember that first day we got the news, and we were like, we're going to try to call as many people as we can, because we want to tell them personally what happened before the service at night. And we called a bunch of folks, and we did as best as we could. And there was just some folks that probably should have been called, but we just couldn't get to it. And I understand that some people were upset about that, and rightly so. But we did the best that we could in the circle that we could, right? For those couple of weeks where it was a whirlwind, we did the best that we could, and that was okay, right? And to have grace for yourself in the work that you're doing, because it's hard. The other thing I would add is that it's never too early to start talking about death and grief. It's never too early to start having shared leadership. Never too early to plan for authenticity. That we do those things ahead of time, because when it comes, and it's going to come, the hard things, not that it'll be too late, but it'll be so much harder to do it when that happens. So how can we start already thinking about these things? How can we start talking about death in our congregations in a way that destigmatizes it, but in a way that is honest and real?
Thank you so much to both of you for being our guests today, for such a beautiful conversation that I hope has encouraged those listening to make space for their grief, to know their grief is okay, and to know that God is with them in it. And I think of when Jesus said in the wonderful, bizarre, upside down, illogical, but perfectly logical in God's kingdom Beatitudes, blessed are those who mourn, which when you're mourning, it does not feel blessed, for they shall be comforted. And God's promises to us are so, so good. And that's, I think, such a reminder that God is with us in all of these things. And that would be my prayer for those listening. They know God is also still with them. Thanks for joining us today, everyone.